August 7, 1944, Morton, France. Oberst Rudolf Batcherer stood in the operations room of the 116th Panzer Division, staring at a map that made no sense. His intelligence officers had plotted American movements for the past 3 weeks. The pattern was there, clear as day. Patton's Third Army advanced along major roads, hitting weak points, exploiting gaps. Textbook armored warfare. Batcherer's staff had calculated the next move, positioned units accordingly, prepared killing zones along Highway N-176. The Americans would come that way. They had to. Every tactical manual, every principle of armored warfare said so. At 0600 hours, the attack came. Not on N-176. Not even close. Patton's columns materialized 15 kilometers south. On farm roads his maps didn't even label as trafficable. By the time Batcherer repositioned, the Americans had punched through, cut his supply lines, and disappeared again. The question gnawed at him then, and would haunt German commanders for the next 9 months. How do you stop an enemy who refuses to be predictable? George S. Patton assumed command of the Third Army on August 1, 1944. The German High Command knew him well. Too well, perhaps. They had studied his Sicily campaign, analyzed his maneuvers in North Africa with Rommel's own reports. They understood his aggressive nature, his preference for speed over consolidation, his willingness to outrun his supply lines. This knowledge felt like an advantage. General Major Hans von Funk, commanding the 47th Panzer Corps, had written in his July 28 assessment that Patton was tactically predictable despite his operational boldness. The report detailed Patton's tendency to strike along Axis roads, his reliance on main supply routes, his pattern of hitting the same types of objectives. Von Funk's analysis made sense. Armored divisions need roads, supply columns need infrastructure. Thousands of vehicles can't simply drive across countryside. The panzer commanders prepared their defenses accordingly, positioning forces along the obvious routes, the logical approaches, the places where American armor had to go. They were preparing for the Patton they had studied. They weren't prepared for what Patton had become. The German defensive doctrine in France was built on predictability, not their own, but their enemies. After 5 years of war, the Wehrmacht had developed sophisticated defensive tactics based on pattern recognition. They tracked unit movements, identified habitual behaviors, predicted attack routes based on previous operations. This wasn't guesswork. It was mathematics. If an American division attacked along a certain road on Monday, probability said they would use similar roads on Tuesday. If they concentrated forces at river crossings, you positioned artillery to cover river crossings. The system worked because armies, by necessity, developed routines. Logistics demanded it. Coordination required it. Staff planning depended on it. Oberst Horst Niemack, Chief of Staff for the 7th Army, had refined this approach into doctrine. His August 3 memorandum outlined the principle: American armored operations follow identifiable patterns within 72-hour cycles. Units return to previously successful approaches. Commanders repeat tactics that worked. This repetition creates vulnerability. His staff had documented 17 instances in Normandy where American units had used the same attack routes twice, sometimes 3 times. Each repetition had allowed German forces to inflict heavier casualties, delay advances, exact higher costs. The pattern was clear: exploit American predictability. But Niemack's memo included a troubling footnote about the Third Army. Initial observations suggested different behavior. His analysts couldn't identify patterns. Attack routes seemed random, disconnected from previous operations. Niemack dismissed this as insufficient data. He needed more observations. He was right about needing more data. He was catastrophically wrong about what that data would show. By August 10, 1944, German intelligence officers across the Western Front were reporting the same phenomenon. They couldn't predict Patton. The 11th Panzer Division's war diary from August 12 documents the frustration. At 14:30 hours, reconnaissance reported American columns moving toward Al-Anon on Route D-311. Division Commander General Lieutenant Wend von Wiedersheim positioned 3 Kampfgruppen to defend the approach, with artillery pre-registered on likely assembly areas. At 18:20 hours, American forces struck Al-Anon, not from D-311. From D-916, a secondary road his maps showed as unsuitable for heavy armor. Von Wiedersheim's carefully prepared defenses fired on empty roads, while Patton's tanks rolled through his flank. The next day, August 13th, von Wiedersheim repositioned based on the new approach. Patton came from a third direction, using logging roads. On August 14th, a fourth route, this time cross-country, using farm tracks. 4 days, 4 completely different approaches to 4 different objectives. The pattern was that there was no pattern. What German commanders didn't know was that Patton had made unpredictability a weapon, not through chaos, but through system. His operations officer, Colonel Halley Maddox, later described the process. After every operation, Patton's staff conducted what they called route audits. They documented every road used, every approach taken, every axis of advance. Then they marked those routes as forbidden for future operations. Not temporarily forbidden, permanently forbidden for that phase of the campaign. If Third Army used a road to attack Le Mans, that road was struck from planning maps for the entire Brittany campaign. The rule was absolute. Maddox recorded Patton's explanation from an August 8th staff meeting. The Germans are professional soldiers. They learn. They adapt. Every time we use a road, we're teaching them. Every repeated approach is a lesson we're giving the enemy for free. I don't believe in educating Germans. This wasn't tactical guidance. This was operational mandate. Third Army's attack plans required 3 distinct approach routes for every objective. If planners couldn't identify 3 separate routes, the objective was reconsidered. Staff officers spent hours studying terrain maps, aerial photographs, French road surveys from the 1930s. They identified farm roads, logging tracks, even ancient Roman routes that modern military maps didn't show. Engineer battalions traveled ahead of combat units, rapidly improving marginal roads just enough for armor to pass, then moving to the next route. The system created enormous logistical complexity. Supply columns couldn't follow predictable routes either. Third Army's Quartermaster Section maintained rotating supply schedules, changing delivery routes every 48 hours. Fuel trucks that serviced 4th Armored Division via one road on Tuesday used completely different roads on Thursday. Medical evacuation routes changed daily. Even command post locations shifted constantly. Patton's headquarters moved 23 times in the first 30 days of August, an average of once every 31 hours. The German intelligence apparatus, built on pattern recognition, found nothing to recognize. Prisoner interrogations revealed the scale of the problem. Hauptmann Erich Schneider, captured near Chartres on August 16th, told his interrogators that his battalion had been repositioned 4 times in 3 days, each time to defend against an American attack from a different direction. Each time, the Americans came from yet another direction. His unit never fired a shot in a prepared defense. They were always reacting, always repositioning, always arriving at defensive positions, only to discover the Americans were already past them. The mathematical advantage Niemack had described worked in reverse. If repetition created vulnerability, unpredictability created invincibility. Not absolute invincibility, but operational invincibility. German forces couldn't concentrate where they didn't know the Americans would strike. They couldn't prepare defenses for approaches they couldn't predict. They couldn't pre-position artillery for targets that kept changing. By mid-August, some German commanders stopped trying to predict. They spread forces evenly, defending everywhere because they couldn't defend anywhere specifically. This was exactly what Patton wanted. Thin defenses everywhere meant weak defenses everywhere. The full impact of Patton's unpredictability doctrine crystallized during the drive to the Moselle River in September 1944. General-Lieutenant Otto von Nobelsdorf, commanding the German First Army, faced an impossible problem. His intelligence staff had tracked Third Army movements for 6 weeks. They had mapped every approach, documented every route, analyzed every operation. Their conclusion, presented in a September 8 briefing, American attack patterns are non-repetitive to the point of operational inefficiency. Third Army is using demonstrably inferior routes, accepting higher fuel consumption and maintenance costs, apparently to avoid using superior routes previously utilized. Von Nobelsdorf saw the opportunity. If Patton was deliberately avoiding good roads, German forces could ignore those roads, concentrate on the bad roads Patton was forced to use. He issued orders on September 9th, repositioning the 3rd and 15th Panzer Grenadier Divisions to defend secondary approaches to Nancy and Metz. His logic was sound. His timing was catastrophic. On September 10th, Patton changed the rules. After 6 weeks of avoiding major highways, Third Army launched a massive assault along Route N57, a primary road his forces hadn't touched since August 3rd. The German forces defending N57 were skeleton crews. Von Nobelsdorf had stripped them to reinforce the secondary roads. The 4th Armored Division covered 42 kilometers in 11 hours, the fastest sustained advance of the campaign. Von Nobelsdorf's repositioned units, defending roads Patton didn't use, couldn't respond in time. The Americans were across the Moselle before German forces even understood what had happened. But here's what made it devastating. Patton didn't just return to a previously used road. He returned to a previously used road after establishing that the Germans had learned to defend everywhere else. The unpredictability had taught the Germans to spread thin. The sudden predictability exploited that dispersal. Von Nobelsdorf's September 11th report to Army Group G was bitter. The enemy has achieved a level of operational flexibility that makes conventional defensive planning impossible. We prepare for chaos, they attack with order. We prepare for order, they attack with chaos. There is no defensive doctrine for this. The Moselle crossings cost Third Army 1,400 casualties. German intelligence estimated that defending the same operation with forces in optimal positions would have cost the Americans at least 4,000 casualties and 3 to 4 additional days. Those 2,600 lives saved and 72 hours gained came from a simple principle: never teach the enemy where you're going. The numbers tell the story that narrative cannot fully capture. Between August 1st and December 31st, 1944, Patton's Third Army conducted 147 major offensive operations. German intelligence officers working from captured documents and post-war records identified route repetition in only 6 of those operations, a 4.1% repetition rate. By comparison, the First Army under Courtney Hodges showed route repetition in 43 of 98 operations, a 43.9% rate. The casualty differential was stark. Third Army suffered an average of 38 casualties per kilometer, advanced in August through October. First Army, fighting in similar terrain against similar opposition, averaged 61 casualties per kilometer. The difference represented approximately 8,200 lives saved through operational unpredictability alone. German commanders acknowledged the impact in post-war interrogations. General Major Rudolf Freiherr von Gersdorf, Chief of Staff for the 7th Army, provided detailed testimony in March 1946. He described how German defensive planning against Third Army deteriorated into guesswork by mid-September. His staff had stopped trying to predict Patton's routes and instead attempted to defend all possible routes simultaneously. A tactical impossibility that guaranteed weakness everywhere. The speed differential was equally dramatic. Third Army advanced an average of 87 kilometers per week during the August breakout, compared to 52 kilometers per week for First Army and 44 kilometers per week for British Second Army. Weather, terrain, and opposition strength were roughly equivalent. The variable was predictability. Patton's refusal to repeat approaches meant German forces were consistently out of position, reacting rather than preparing. The validation came from an unexpected source, Patton's own supply problems. Third Army notoriously outran its logistics, creating fuel crises that halted operations multiple times. But analysis of supply records reveals something counterintuitive. The varied approach routes actually consumed 18% less fuel than projected for a conventional advance along main roads. Why? Because Third Army rarely fought for roads. They went around defended positions rather than through them. A 10-kilometer detour on an undefended farm road cost less fuel and time than a 5-kilometer assault on a defended highway. Patton never wrote a manual on unpredictability. He didn't need to. He had understood something fundamental about human cognition that military doctrine rarely addressed. Learning creates vulnerability. Every pattern is a promise. Every repetition is a gift to the enemy. This wasn't about chaos for its own sake. It was about denying the enemy the one thing they needed most: certainty. German commanders were brilliant tacticians who had spent 5 years learning to read battlefields, predict opponents, prepare for contingencies. Patton made their expertise worthless by refusing to be read. The principle extends beyond military operations. In any competitive environment, predictability equals vulnerability. The business that always releases products in January teaches competitors to prepare counter-launches in December. The negotiator, who always makes their best offer third, teaches opponents to wait for the third offer. The athlete, who always attacks the same way, teaches defenders exactly where to position. Patton's doctrine whispers a truth that feels wrong but proves right. The best route isn't the optimal route. It's the unexpected route. Reliability doesn't mean consistency. It means achieving objectives regardless of path. After the war, Soviet military theorists studied Patton's campaigns extensively. Their doctrine of maskirovka, the art of military deception, incorporated his principles of route variation. Modern American doctrine includes multi-axis operations as standard practice. Every military academy teaches that predictability is vulnerability. They're teaching Patton's lesson, learned by German commanders at terrible cost across France in 1944, you cannot defend against an enemy you cannot predict, and you cannot predict an enemy who refuses to teach you.